was supposed to be a simple hiking camping trip, just a weekend away from the city. But when our group arrived at the forest, something felt off right away. We hiked into the forest for about 6 hours. The trees seemed to loom over us, dark and menacing, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. We found a suitable spot and set up camp anyway, convincing ourselves that it was just our imaginations running wild, no one wanting to seem weak around the other guys. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows, trying to act normal. But there was still a strange feeling among us. But as the fire died down and we began to retire to our tents, we realized that something was really actually wrong. We couldn't find the path that led us into the forest. Our sense of the forest seemed distorted. The sounds... It's hard to talk about the sounds we were hearing. It was so terrifying. Panic and confusion set in as we stumbled around in the darkness, our flashlights barely illuminating the way. It was as if somehow the forest around us had been swapped for another horrifying reality. Nothing made sense. We scrambled around into the forest trying to find the path not far at all, and when we turned around we could no longer see our camp. We scrambled around more searching for it. It should have been right behind us, maybe 40 feet, and there was still a fire and some lights, so we should have been able to see it easily, but everything was pitch dark in every direction. It was so confusing and quickly overwhelming. That's when we heard it. The distant sound of footsteps, like someone walking through the underbrush. We called out, but there was no response. We kept walking, scrambling, hoping to find our way out, but the footsteps only grew louder, and we began to hear whispers on the wind, coming from every direction, voices that seemed to be speaking directly into our minds. The forest seemed to continuously warp and twist around us, the trees stretching impossibly high, and the shadows creeping closer. Every rustling leaf or snapping twig made us jump, our hearts pounding in our chests. And then we saw it. A figure, barely visible in the gloom, standing just beyond the edge of our flashlight's beams. We froze, unable to move or speak as the figure stepped forward. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothes and carrying a lantern that cast an eerie glow on her face. Her eyes were black as pitch, and her hair hung in tangled knots around her shoulders. She beckoned to us, and we knew, somehow, that we had no choice but to follow, like we were hypnotized or in a trance. We stumbled after her, our feet sinking into the soft earth as we navigated through the twisted trees and thick underbrush. The whispers grew louder, the voices more insistent, until we were sure we were losing our minds. They were like whispers, except screaming inside our minds. And then suddenly, the woman stopped, turning to face us with a look of pure malice in her eyes.
"You should not have come here,"
she hissed.
"The woods will be with you forever."
And then she vanished, leaving us alone in the darkest dark with nothing but the sound of our own breathing and the pounding of our hearts. We knew that we were lost, trapped in this alternate horror reality with no hope of escape. We tried to move, but it was all the same everywhere we went. The same looking, distorted forest, tall, twisted trees, and tangled brush everywhere. There was no indication of any sensible direction at all. It was darker than dark can ever be. We then started to hear the sounds of other creatures, footsteps, howls and snarls, whispers, and almost like a laughter. Those were not natural at all. It was happening in all directions and moving around, sometimes very close. Our senses were overwhelmed. This continued for hours at varying levels of intensity. Every second felt like we had to fight for our lives. I was terrified at a level that can't be described with words. Hours and hours this went on. I don't know how we made it through that night. As the sun started to finally rise, things grew quieter. We felt less confused, as though a haze of alternate reality had lifted and our senses returned to normal. We stumbled out of the forest, disheveled and traumatized. We never spoke of what happened to us again, until now, over 5 years later. I've had nightmares, seeing that woman every single night in my sleep since that night in the woods. I've never been right since that night. I carry something with me and it never leaves. Whatever you do, don't go into that forest.